You're listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast from S&P Global Market Intelligence. In each episode, our experts will provide you with the where, how, and when to make decisions that transform your business.
Hello, and a warm welcome to our latest PMI-based podcast from S&P Global Market Intelligence. I'm Paul Smith, a director in the team that produces PMI figures for over 30 countries across the world. And today I'm delighted to be joined by two fellow economists who specialise in the production of our survey-based data. Firstly, we have regular guest, fellow economics director Andrew Harker, and making her first appearance on our PMI podcast, I'm joined by Jingyi Pan, economics associate director with S&P Global. Welcome to you both, and just to set the scene, to outline what we're going to be covering today, we're going to be looking specifically at two countries that we cover with our PMI surveys and use these as a window to highlight wider international trends that we've been seeing developing in our datasets in recent months. After that, we'll shift focus to take a closer view of labour markets, especially with regards to employment growth and the role this is playing in wage determination, and of course, elevated inflation in some areas of the world. So let's get straight into this. One thing that has struck me recently has, globally speaking, been some differences between manufacturing and services sector performances. So maybe I can come to you, Jingyi, first, and you could discuss some of these developments in Australia as a way to illustrate divergences between industry and service sector economies.
Good day, Paul. Thanks for the warm introduction. I'm definitely happy to be on my first podcast with the PMI team here. So I think you pointed out a great one on Australia, and for that itself, we do have the Judo Bank Australia PMI that has been consolidated by us here at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And you brought out the point on the divergence between manufacturing and services. We've recently started putting out that SME data for Australia, and I think what's interesting is that it's actually much more pronounced for these SMEs. But taking a step back, I just really want to point out two things from Australia that I see in terms of these divergences, one being output, the other being prices. So you do see the gap between manufacturing and services still very pronounced in Australia itself, even though there are some signs of closing with the latest June data indicating that slowdown in service activity, which mirrors that global trend. Definitely that still exists, and of course, as said, services itself. So we are seeing services price charge have actually taken over to record a higher rate of inflation as compared to manufacturing globally, and that's also been the case for Australia in the past 3 months.
And what's your reading of the reasons for this divergence in performance?
Yeah, Paul, I think we have those anecdotal evidences which feed into our comment trackers too. And suddenly we are seeing that kind of high interest rates coming out, being very prominent in our data, in saying how that's really eroding some of the demand for Australia. That's playing a little bit of a bigger part in weighing on the goods producing sector as compared to services. But, at the root of it all, what I am also seeing is just really that kind of shift of demand from manufacturing to services. We know that Australia's borders have eased gradually last year, but 2023 this year, that's the first year we're getting all this unrestricted worldwide traveling, and that certainly helped to power services since. And just to share, while not Australia, I've just returned from traveling to Japan, and I can feel all the rejuvenating effects from sushi, sake, onsens. So I can see the reason why this is the case. And I know, Paul, Andrew, it's not going to apply to you from the UK. From Singapore here, Japan is perhaps not half as exciting to some of the other places my friends are going, Rome, Santorini, you name it.
I'd be more than happy to go to Japan. What's quite interesting, of course, is that what you're seeing in Japan, Australia, in terms of tourism, I get the feeling that's happening in Europe as well. I think there's I would call it a continued normalization of people's activity and spending post-COVID. Despite that tougher backdrop in terms of cost of living and higher interest rates, etc. As I hinted at there, I feel similar developments in Europe as well. Is that something you're seeing, Andrew, in some of the data that we're collecting and picking up?
Yeah, that's right. So it's good to hear about Jingy's holiday. The closest I'm getting to somewhere like Greece at the moment is just talking about it on the podcast, but that's all right. I did want to highlight Greece this month, actually, because the manufacturing sector is standing out in the Eurozone at the moment. It's the only one which is seeing output and new orders rising. And I think we can attribute that in part to the tourism effect. Actually, I saw the Greek tourism minister saying that they think 2023 is going to see about between 10 and 20% more numbers on the tourist side than they had last year. So that does seem to be going well. And if you think about the structure of the manufacturing sector in Greece, a fair amount of it is those food and drink firms, and they're going to be benefiting from improved demand in the sort of hotels and restaurant sectors. And so that's really boosting things in Greece at the moment compared to some of the other Eurozone manufacturing industries, which are maybe focused in different areas and struggling a bit for now.
Yeah, but I think we picked up that tourism angle in the service sector economies, haven't we? Of places like, from my perspective, one of the countries I'm responsible for is Italy. So I picked that up in the Italian PMIs. I think it's happened in Spain as well. But it's quite interesting how we've been able to focus on manufacturing in Greece and obviously its exposure to food and drink and other tourist areas. How's this feeding through to and moving us towards probably one of the topics that we want to look at today in terms of employment growth? Has that had a positive impact in terms of demand and growth in workers in Greece?
It has, yes. Good news on the employment front in Greece as well, on the manufacturing side. As we would expect, those new orders and employment and output growth that we're seeing has fed through to rises in staffing levels. And that continued in June. It actually picked up in June, the rate of job creation. And even more impressively, if you take all the manufacturing sectors we cover worldwide, I think it's just over 30. Greece actually saw the strongest rise in employment of all of them. So real positive news coming out of the Greek employment front.
Absolutely. That's taken me a little bit by surprise, the strong performance of Greece. It's a good statistic of the month, I think, from you there, Andrew. On a broader basis, obviously Greece is leading the pack there in terms of manufacturing, but looking at employment growth more broadly across the world, I think it has held up pretty well against that challenging macro backdrop, elevated inflation, tighter monetary policy, or maybe linked to a better than expected resilience in services economies, especially in 2023 so far. I want to spend a little time unpacking the causes of this employment growth and the context of tightness in labour markets and the potential knock-on effects that we've seen in wages and, of course, the inflation outlook for a number of countries. So, Jing, maybe you could just give us like a high-level overview of some of the latest trends in employment at the global level.
Yeah, definitely, Paul. I think the theme of divergence that we've spoken about, likewise for the labor market, I think that's pretty obvious. So let's start with manufacturing. I think what we're seeing for the employment side of things is that while employment level have not shrank like output did for manufacturing in the latest June round of PMI surveys, it's only been seeing this kind of marginal growth since the start of the year. This stagnation that seems to be going on with the absence of new orders growth for goods. A lot of goods producers themselves also clearing their backlogs at a historically elevated level. So on our dashboard, you will be seeing more than half of the countries that we survey, in fact, are actually seeing lower employment levels in June. Half of them really flashing red, whereas for the service sector, that's all green. So we are seeing all the countries that we survey continue to hire in June itself. Firms have continued to indicate that they're rebuilding their workforce capacity post-COVID with the return of more service demand, and I think just really a bit of a sense of shortages going on for the service sector.
That kind of speaks to that divergence that we mentioned at the start between manufacturing and services economies at the moment around the world. I know, Jingy, you keep a really close eye, don't you, on the details here in employment. And when we talk about something like the services economy, that's a vast range of, shall we say, subsectors, a wide range of different kind of industries, if you like, make up the services economy. What's your feeling and what are you seeing within a more granular kind of sector basis in terms of employment?
Yeah, Paul, I'm glad you mentioned this. I think the beauty of our PMI data is that over and above the ability to look at it from a country level, you're also able to dissect it on the sector basis. So our global sector PMI that typically comes out about 1 to 2 days after the composite and the services numbers itself, that you can actually look at employment in sub-index for each of these sectors as well. And I think what we have been seeing for the global sector PMI employment trends is that it's also very much aligned with what we're seeing for its new orders. So on that end itself, we're seeing some of these shining through. So you're talking about the likes of financial services, 4 of the top 5 ranking subsectors on the employment side of things are actually falling the financial services category, and that's been led by the real estate sector. The 4th one, the other one that's not within it, actually is our tourism and recreation. I think as you recall, actually tourism and recreation was ranking higher, but that's been slipping a little bit in June alongside the wider sector trend.
Yeah, what about, I guess, just they're hinting at tourism actually slipping down the rankings. What about if we go down towards the lower end of the ranking? Who's the weakest performance in terms of employment at the moment?
Yeah, so if we go down and down, I think what you are seeing, this surprising or unsurprising, is also a service subsector. So that is actually our healthcare services subsector. As we know that this defensive sector itself had actually been seeing peak employment improvement during that whole pandemic period. Suddenly at this point of time post-COVID, we are seeing a little bit of a weakness itself. Broadly for healthcare services, the trend itself is also a little bit steady. We are seeing on the more cyclical end of things is actually what follows. So that for what we have is actually one of these goods producers, forestry and paper products.
Yeah, so it all fits into that specific context of different sectors. Like I said, we cover such a range of sectors. Sometimes it's useful to get into the details given the vastness of particularly the services economy. Turning to you, Andrew, I think what's really interesting and useful with PMI data is that we can usually attribute some reasons. Now, I gave some kind of speculative factors, but I think what you can do is really actually put a little bit more meat on the bones, if you like. Now, we don't just collect quantitative data with our surveys. We also collect qualitative information, asking companies why a variable's gone up or down. If you could spend a little time, Andrew, just seeing what's going on in that kind of qualitative data, I think that would be really useful for listeners.
Yeah, so I'm going to make use of our comment tracker data for this. And I think we spoke about it a few episodes ago on one of our previous podcasts. This is where we get all the reasons that companies give us for the changes that they're seeing in the data. And we amalgamate them and put them into sort of time series where we can judge them against the long run trends for the particular categories. I thought I'd bring a few out today. One of them is about staff shortages. So we've got the staff shortages tracker. And now that currently is running at normal levels, but that really peaked last year, so it spiked much higher last year, and we're seeing reports of staff shortages way in advance of what we would normally see. Companies are to some extent still scarred by that. They're reluctant to lose staff at the moment because they're worried that they might have that trouble again trying to get hold of people. And to some extent, companies are still filling vacancies that they've had for some period of time. I think that's something that we've seen come through in the anecdotals quite a bit. Certainly that I've seen is companies saying, yeah, we're hiring, but it's filling long-term vacancies basically from last year. And so I think what that's doing is it's really causing a reluctance among firms to reduce staffing levels, even if they are seeing sometimes output coming down. And if you look at actually another of our comment trackers, which covers those companies that are lowering output due to cost cutting, that's running at really quite reduced levels, so just around half of what we would normally see. So there's a real sense that companies are reluctant to let go of staff just based on a cost aspect, which may be a bit surprising given that we've been in such an inflationary environment. But yeah, so it looks like companies are still trying to keep hold of staff where they can.
Yeah, which of course speaks to that them theories, doesn't it, of labour hoardings and them things that we've seen put forward by a variety of economists in recent months. One thing I wanted to do is just cast our minds back a little bit to the start of the year with one of our podcasts, and we flagged what we thought was quite important for us to all be watching in the coming months, this was at the start of the year, was the impact potentially of elevated wage pressures and second round effects for inflation. A rise in prices leads to higher wages, back to higher prices, and so on and so forth. That was one of our top 10 things to watch, because I think we felt that it had implications potentially for monetary policy to be tighter than perhaps people were expecting, especially in some areas of Europe. We've sat in the UK today. Again, we heard today when we're recording this podcast of continued elevated wage pressures in the UK. How's that kind of information, Andrew, looking in commentary tracker terms, in terms of salary pressures? What are you seeing in the data for that at the moment?
Looking through the comment tracker, we've got one specifically on salary pressures, and it is still running above average. So we're looking around reports of salary pressures around twice the normal level at the moment. Now, that is down a bit from the peak, again, which was last year, but still pretty elevated compared to what you'd normally see.
Yeah, and that has a causal factor then, doesn't it, in potentially changes in costs for companies. What we're seeing, what are we hearing with regards to that amongst the companies that we're surveying?
Yeah, so that has been feeding through. If you think about, particularly on the services side, those wage pressures are a big part of their expenses. And so it does have an impact on costs and then feeding through to output prices as well. So if you look at our index where we're looking at output prices being raised due to higher salaries, that is extremely elevated at the moment, running between 3 and 4 times the normal level. So it really does seem that's one of the key drivers of rising selling prices at the moment are those wage pressures.
Absolutely, and labour costs they're one factor input, but of course, particularly in the services economy, they're a hugely important input. Jingy, just coming back to you, obviously we've got an employment cost driver, but in terms of the overall package of costs, what are you seeing in terms of our prices data?
What I really want to spotlight here is that we have our global composite output prices, which actually includes both manufacturing and services. That index itself had actually fallen by 1 full index point in June to 53.4. That is actually the lowest since December 2020. But make no mistake here, I think what this itself is still showing us is that it is historically elevated, and to a large extent this is services driven. So I think really brings together the point we talk about employment going on strong in the services side of things, and also how Andrew has just mentioned about wages itself, because on the other flip side we have manufacturing price, and this is actually both below the 50 neutral point, showing deflation. So services driven sort of price increase now.
Yeah, but one thing I did pick up with the latest data, though, was composite input costs were actually a little bit higher, in the latest survey round. What are your thoughts on that?
Paul, I think that's absolutely a great question. So that itself, our PMI composite price index, the input price index itself, I know we are not supposed to really talk about charts on the podcast, but I think I just really want to point out at this point, it's a very great leading indicator for official CPI numbers. Now, if I could just urge everyone on the podcast to take a look at our PMI analysis page itself, you could see a lot of charts comparing the input price index, giving you months ahead signal for what the official CPI is going to do. So coming back to our question on what the composite input price index is telling us at this point, it's actually increased a little bit, but overall I think it is telling us that the official CPI index on a global scale is expected to fall further from the 5.3% in May itself, but based on our estimation, it's unlikely to at this point be past 4%, falling past 4%. So I think that's some food for thoughts, especially for our podcast listeners who may be looking quite closely at the markets, and especially for monetary policies as well.
That's a really great and interesting point. Excuse the pun there when we're talking about interest rates, but it just highlights how that muddies the waters, doesn't it, for policymakers at the moment. I think we've clearly got strong deflation dynamics in manufacturing, but the focus on inflation and particularly any differences that we see around the world are definitely predominantly now found in services economies. And then, of course, you've got the lagged impact of tighter monetary policy, which in time should take greater hold on consumption activities But unpicking that relationship between rates and economic activity, especially in developed markets, seems really challenging at the moment, especially if we can call it the post-pandemic world. Still, I think as we're coming up and wrapping up the latest podcast, I think the best way to see how the world economy develops and how policymakers are reacting is to look on a monthly basis and keep abreast of the PMI data. And probably just to flag, our next big release is the flash PMIs from various areas across the world on July the 24th this month. So something definitely to look out for. But sadly, I think we're out of time for today. That was a great, useful, engaging discussion as ever on the PMIs. My thanks to Andrew as ever and Jingyi for a great contribution today. And I look forward to chairing our next podcast later on in the year. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast. Connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.